Good day, my farmtastic friends. Farmer Phil Quinn here, making an apple crisp with some heritage varieties or heirloom varieties. Important to keep those old varieties around. I know all the newer varieties coming out are sweeter and more crunchy and more resistant to disease and stuff. But where do those new varieties come from? They all come from the older varieties. To get this lovely empire, we had to cross the Macintosh and the Red Delicious. To get the Cordelia, we had to cross the Delcorf and a Cortland, the old Cortland variety. Cordelia, just amazing. Fruity apple, nice and crunchy. Oyase, a cross of Honeycrisp and something weird, I forget what it is. And nothing better in your apple crisp than an old Lombard or even a Saint Laurent variety, nice and acidic, and it'll stay crunchy when you cook it. So those old varieties are important to keep around, just for genetic diversity's sake. So for more on that, here's the rest of this week's Farm to Food podcast, all about heritage livestock and heritage fruit and veg. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Farm to Food podcast. I'm Hugh Maynard, publisher of the Gleaner newspaper down in the Chateauguay Valley, and the team that brings you this podcast on a bi-weekly basis. The theme of this episode is heritage farming. Heritage farming is all about preserving traditional farming methods, livestock, crops that have been passed down through the generations. It focuses on sustainability, biodiversity, and maintaining a deep connection to the land and cultural history. We can think of it as honouring the old ways while still feeding the future. So we're going to look at several aspects of heritage farming on this podcast. I'd like to welcome Sarah Rennie, who's the news editor with The Gleaner, our local newspaper, to talk about heritage farming. And perhaps a good place to start would be heirloom tomatoes.
Definitely a great place to start. And we actually have a seed saver who lives in Howick. This is Mr. David Promanta, and he has a business called Semence Heritage, and he grows 6,000 heirloom tomato plants per year, and he harvests the seeds from them for his business. He sees himself as a seed saver or a seed keeper of rare seeds that have been nearly lost over time. Some seed varieties have been available for centuries, 500 years, some of them. Other seeds are very new, but heirloom tomatoes are special. So in an interview with The Gleaner a few months ago, he actually described how many varieties of seeds disappeared in Europe in the early 20th century after governments prohibited small-scale producers from sharing their seeds. So as a result, about 60% of the seeds that were available at that time entirely disappeared. So I was chatting with him just earlier this morning, and he was talking about how sometimes these seeds survive, and heirloom seeds, which are these ancient varieties, can last a very long time, and sometimes in very strange places. So he was talking to me about this Mémé de Beauce tomato. So these were seeds that were found in the wall of a house in France that had been abandoned for about 60 years. And some of the seeds, believe it or not, were still viable, and he managed to get his hands on some of these. He started producing them, and they're now available on his website. You can buy them from him, and they are absolutely beautiful, gorgeous, and delicious tomatoes.
And that's a very important point because people are probably quite familiar with the Montreal melon, or at least the mention of it, even if they haven't eaten it themselves. And popular in the late 1800s, disappeared from the market and from production, and then was literally resuscitated in 1996 because somebody found some seeds in an Iowa seed bank. So it is an important aspect with heritage breeds to be able to preserve the longevity, even if they're no longer used commercially.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, the heirloom varieties like that melon, for example, are absolutely delicious. And they're things that people just, they really want to try, these old varieties. talking about tomatoes again, heirlooms are just exceptional because the flavor is so much better than the tomatoes that we get from greenhouses now that are done through these massive commercial processes that, tend to have white cores, and they're just not as good. Most of the time, actually, heirlooms, the reason we can't produce them at that scale is because you just can't transport them. That's another thing about these kinds of tomatoes. They've just not been genetically denatured for transport. So they are soft, naturally, and they are thinner skinned. They're juicy, absolutely delicious, but you can't transport them because they bruise and they crack. It also makes growing them a little bit more challenging. And I can say from a personal note, it's very frustrating when you get to a farmer's market, for example, and you have an entire tray full of beautiful heirloom tomatoes, and people have a tendency to want to squeeze their tomatoes to see if they're ripe or if they're ready to eat. And if you squeeze an heirloom tomato, you're going to leave your fingerprints in it.
Right. They used to commercial tomatoes in a supermarket, say, which if you were to squeeze wouldn't impact them at all. Also, I hate to use this word, but the ugliness, right, compared with the smooth and shiny and what you see in the marketing ads and so on and so forth. Does that have an impact on people's choices, or are they really committed to the flavor?
Definitely heirloom tomatoes have a look, right? They're a little bit bumpy. Sometimes they have some ribbing. They're often striped. They have different coloring. Sometimes they have, purple shoulders. We have different varieties that grow on our farm, and certainly David has varieties that he grows that you would certainly refer to as ugly tomatoes.
But beautiful in other ways.
Beautiful, and the people who chase after heirloom tomatoes don't care what they look like, in general.
But they've gone by the wayside for other reasons as well, and that is the commercialization, right? They don't pack as well, they don't transport as well, susceptible to certain kinds of diseases which are difficult to control. But at the same time, on the other side of the ledger, they have this genetic value, which is slowly disappearing out of their use. So why is it important that we continue, not just for the pleasure of eating them, but continue to plant them, grow them, store the seeds?
Yeah, so David spoke about this a little bit, and he talks about the fact that these are just a link to the past. These tomatoes, they are varieties that you don't see everywhere. They're hard to find sometimes. And for him, he grows about 100 that he sells on the market, but he grows, 6,000 tomato plants. He's growing a lot more than 100 varieties for market. And those are ones that he just keeps for himself. And it's because he really feels that we need to keep these seeds because at some point, the greenhouse varieties, are disease resistant now. They may not be for always. You can't continuously hybridize things. And the heirlooms are just a natural tomato, and they go back. It's really like trying to, taking a bite out of something that's grown throughout history.
So heritage, heirloom, we often hear those words around vegetables like tomatoes, as we've been talking. Also applies to apples, which is an industry that's in complete transformation, I think, with new, what they call hybrid dwarf varieties that people love because they're crisp and juicy and they store well. What's the situation with some of the heirloom apples, which I would add, even today, Macintosh, which has been a staple of production in Quebec for 100 years, is slowly losing ground to these newer varieties?
Mm-hmm. What we're starting to see right now is a real transition just in the agricultural landscape, especially in sort of Franklin, Havelock, Hemmingford corridor, where more and more of these dwarf varieties, which are smaller trees that are planted at extremely high densities, as opposed to the old orchards, which used to be these sort of, vast areas where you had these great trees, and the trees reached out with long fingers, and they looked almost Tim Burton-esque, kind of. I think that's the only way I can describe them. And we're starting to see more and more of those trees being taken out because they just take up so much space, and there's so much space left between them as well in order to harvest from them. In order to get more of these dwarf varieties in, because obviously the more apples you can grow, the better it is for your business. And so, in a generation's time, we're going to start to see a lot of those apples. Probably not Max, because there's a lot of people who do cling to their Max. But Spartans, Lobos, some of those varieties, we might start to see them become much more scarce in the valley.
It seems much easier to develop a new variety than to try and improve an old variety. And so some which would be familiar even, I'm not sure I would call a Mac heritage, but certainly it's been around a long time. So what's the purpose of maintaining those types of orchards? Or could you have a dwarf Mac tree that you could then adapt? Are there ways that you can keep the modern techniques applied to these heirloom fruits?
Well, actually, I took a drive very recently just through Franklin, through apple country, just to try to see what I could find out about these older apple varieties and what might be happening to our landscape.
I'm here with Laurie Ann Prevost of Rockburn Orchards in Rockburn, and we're just talking really quickly about older apple varieties. So you're still growing Macs on your orchard?
Yes, we are.
Do you have any of the other older varieties as well? Lobos?
We don't have any Lobos. We've never had Lobo here. But Macintosh, we use, the orchard used to be about 70 to 80% Macintosh. And over the years, we've cut a good quantity, so now it's a very small percentage compared to the others.
And so you find people still want the older varieties?
No, they do not. I have a handful of customers that want Macintosh.
Okay, so people's tastes are really changing then. They're going towards the newer varieties.
Yeah, they like crunchier apples that store better, Honeycrisp, Ambrosia. Empire is an older apple, but it's still quite popular because it's a hard, crunchy apple.
So it's not even just like the kind of apples, it's the taste and it's the storability that people are really looking for now.
Yeah, they like something sweet and crunchy, nothing pasty or soft like a Macintosh.
Yeah, they really are an acquired taste. I think you had to grow up eating Macs. So do you think that's something that's happening with all of the other orchards in the area too? Like I know at one point there was a government program to cut down Macintosh apple trees. Do you think we're looking at a changing landscape then as far as older trees?
Yeah, many orchards have cut down a lot of Macs. There's a lot left out there. People are planting newer varieties. One, they pay better. And with the changing climate, it's getting harder to grow Macs because it's hot in the fall now, so they stay uncolored and they get soft quickly.
Right, they have that almost fluorescent green to them, don't they?
This year we've had color though, surprisingly, because it was nice and cold. But in a regular year, it's very hard to get color on the Macintosh.
So we're talking about dwarf trees then. That's sort of where everybody is heading towards, newer varieties, dwarf trees, and much more intensive growing.
Yeah, more high-density planting. I think now our high density, we're at 1,200 trees per acre. And our older trees are, 400 or 500 trees per acre.
Wow.
If that.
Wow. Okay. So then I guess that's just something in a generation we'll have to get used to. We won't be seeing these trees anymore.
No, the nice big old traditional giant trees are kind of fading away.
Maybe some people will keep them out front for decoration.
Yes, decorative purposes only.
So heritage is not only the plants and the livestock, but also the buildings that are used to house, store, look after the animals. And of course, I think everybody is familiar driving through the countryside, old wooden barns that are falling down or obviously no longer used. Even today, the silos that were recent, I guess you could say, in terms of heritage, 1950s, 60s cement silos that you'll see dotted across, looks like a starship pointing out next to a barn, are now falling out of use, replaced by other technology. And of course, there are many heritage barns that have been around 100, 150, even 200 years old that have been preserved. What's the state of the building heritage out there in the farming landscape?
Yeah, certainly we have a lot of century-old farms, and a lot of the old infrastructure. We are starting to see some of them come down, like you said. But there are a lot of initiatives, a lot of projects. There's a lot of people who are restoring their barns. And just recently, the MRC inaugurated a project that actually sort of reuses or finds a different purpose for some of the silos on farms, including silos that are still functional. But they just launched their Painted Silos series or network with a farm in Franklin with 2 painted silos. And eventually, at the end of this fall, there will be 4 silos that will be painted that are part of this network, and eventually I think it's going to continue growing over the next 2 years as well. And they're stunning. They're beautiful murals that have gone up on these silos, but it's really an homage to this agricultural heritage from the area that the MRC is trying to put in place.
And there are, of course, many silos, and some of them will, I guess, over time fall over as buildings do. But it's nice to see that recognition of the important role that piece of cement, because that's what it was, or some of them were steel, made to feeding the livestock and generating the dairy industry and the beef industry that we have today.
And that really was the point. The MRC, they've been working on this project for several years now. And they had a lot to say about these silos, but essentially they're part of our landscape. And most of the time now we don't even notice them. And so this was a way of really highlighting the fact that 97% of the Haut-Saint-Laurent is actually zoned green or agricultural. It's part of the heritage and it's part of our ongoing culture. And they really wanted to pay tribute to, those early farmers, but also just to this heritage that's so dominant in the area.
So when you're driving down Route 138 through the heart of the Chateauguay Valley, or the 201 up to Franklin to go on the Apple route, and you see these brightly coloured silos out in a field next to an old barn, now you know where they came from and what they represent. But what else is going on with heritage buildings, particularly the old Barnwood ones, which have been out of use for a good number of decades?
So I had a great conversation with Simon Brennan, who is known sort of in the area and certainly in Montreal as Mr. Barnwood, who one of the things that he does is take down century-old barns, and he repurposes the wood, makes beautiful furniture and all kinds of incredibly creative and beautiful things out of these old boards. So here's my conversation with Simon. I'm here with Simon Brennan, otherwise known as Mr. Barnwood, who is in Franklin. And we're going to have a chat about Barnwood and the agricultural landscape of the valley. So you've been working with Barnwood for how long now?
It's been pretty close to 10 years now.
And you are someone who people will call when they want to have a barn taken down or when they have barnwood that they want removed.
Yeah, they'll call me and I'll make the decision whether it's worth taking down or not.
So maybe you can tell me a little bit, when you go into some of these barns, and some of these must be century old at least, what can you tell about the agricultural history, or just the history or the culture of the people who built that barn just from the wood?
Well, you can tell a few things. When I walk in the door, sometimes I'll look up and I'll look around and I can see that a lot of the timbers that got cut for those barns were usually timbers that were on the property. So they didn't have to move like these big timbers around, and they can hew them, which, they took the axe and they hewed 4 sides of them to square them up and to put them into place. But you can tell there was a lot of manual labor involved, and you can tell that, people worked extremely hard, but very well. They built things and they were built to last.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, and they're still standing after 100 years. That's pretty incredible. Some of the barns I've been in, it's just amazing the size of the wood that was used.
Yeah, and without having too many engineers, I don't think at the time, they knew that if they oversized things, they were safe. In the valley here in particular, I can think of a few places where the hand-hewn beams were actually monstrous and reflecting sometimes the size of the barn. So, sometimes you saw some good 12 by 12s or even hand-hewn pieces, what we call sleepers, which sleepers are normally wider than they are thick, usually used on old ancestral homes, right? And sometimes we've seen some stuff that borders on 17, 18, 19 inches wide by 6 or 7 inches thick. So they're absolutely massive pieces. And they were all from original growth forests, stuff that was here long before any settler arrived.
Right. So I wouldn't be lying then if I suggested that
Barnwood tells a story.
Absolutely. And I find it fascinating because every time I go into my inventory, I can look around and say, oh, look at that board. Look where that board's been. And you can almost trace it back. Like, I'll give you a perfect example of one of them where I remember seeing a board that had a bit of cement on it. It had these small speckles on it from where there were nails. And so that gave me a clue. I said, oh, hold on a second. This was once used. They used it to pour a foundation. And at one point, it was up on the roof because it had all these tons of little nail holes, which indicated that there was cedar shingles at one time on the roof, which right off the bat, that's going to, date your barn back to a certain era way before tin. So you say, okay, wow, there's like a history developing. And the beauty behind it is that, okay, wow, they've used this board several times. They've recycled it. And then it's given me a story as I look at it.
Do you think that's one of the reasons that Barnwood is so popular right now, is that it has those marks, it has that history?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody, who lived in the city, and they said that, well, everything's very practical. We just buy IKEA furniture, we put it up, and it does its job. And for sure, I can attest to that because, practical is great. But there's a group of people who say, oh, man, I want something real. I want something that's going to be, that has a story to it, that has a life to it. And not only that, but like have a lot of meaning to it.
I think people are clinging to that sort of thing right now, the authenticity and that heritage, because the heritage and the culture is so rich. Especially out here, you see the barns dotting the landscape all over the place.
It is. And it tells a beautiful story too of, the Scots who came to settle here, in the late 1700s, and how they imagined what a barn and what a farm should look like. And you can see a lot of those traditions got carried over too. That you see a lot of those beautiful flat stone foundations in the Franklin area and in Hemmingford. And they brought about, a certain way of building with them that reflects, that period of time.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what's happening to the landscape now also, because of course your business is not restoring barns, it's taking them down. So are these barns just not able to sort of withstand the time, or what's happening?
No, well, actually, a lot of these barns can withstand the time. It's just what's happened is the cost becomes astronomical for the average homeowner to take on. What happens is that you'll have, we'll call it a 30 by 80 foot long barn that requires that you go on the roof and you keep the nails tacked down because they have a tendency of lifting up with time, with frost, and so what happens is you need to paint, and you got to make sure that the water stays away from it, stay away from the sills, and it becomes a lot of maintenance, especially too for older people who don't have the time nor the patience to want to get into that. So you start to see them having to come down, but otherwise, from a structural point of view, something that's been taken care of could last another 100, 200 years. I see mortise and tenon construction that's stronger than nails, and that if kept dry would continue to last for another century. And what happens to the other side of things from a practical point of view, with the size of the machineries we have today, a lot of times they do no longer fit in the old style barns. So a lot of them are taken down and put up, hangars are put up, and for combines and for today's size machinery.
Yeah, no, farming has certainly changed in the last, if we look at even just century-old barns and you imagine what it must have looked like here 100, 150 years ago compared to what it looks like now, just imagine the size of the fields and the equipment that you need to be working that, and just the size of the barns.
I would give my right arm to go back 100 years for a few days.
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I imagine you find other things in the barns as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. I can tell you numerous stories. I can think of one. I was in Ohio a few years ago visiting different Barnwood guys out there. And they had this absolutely beautiful board up in their warehouse showing from 1820 all the way to the latest carving of 1960 something. And it had all the different generations of farmers, and right there, that was the story in itself, and you could see how the whole image of that farming life was put to life in that one board. And occasionally too, we go into a barn and you'll find sometimes old farm implements, and we've found One of my favorite ones personally was a flail.
Wow.
It's a piece of wood. If people don't know what it is, it's a piece of wood with a handle, and it's got a leather section that comes off to another longer piece of wood, which was used to beat the chaff from the wheat.
I'd walked into a barn, and it happens occasionally when I go into those barns. I'll go into the area where they would drive in with a wagon, and they would offload the wheat, and the wheat would go onto this 2-inch thick type of flooring, and they would spread it out, and they would come along with a flail, and they would start beating it, and what it would do would separate the chaff from the plant, and that way, for years and years and years, the farmer used that method. You could see someone who really didn't have a lot of money, didn't have the resources, used that method for years and years, and the floor was beaten even harder. So those boards are really the roughest. Whereas I've seen it where somebody, I guess at one point, flailed for a few years and said, "Oh well, I've had enough of this," and they had enough resources to go out and buy a threshing machine. Mm-hmm. So his boards were roughly beaten maybe for a few years, and they weren't as heavily beaten. So it tells a little bit of a story when you go into a place and you start to see how they lived. And we've seen some too where you'll walk into it and you say, "Oh wow, look at how the ingenious way in which this farmer decided how to feed his cows." He decided, okay, well, I'm building a bank barn since I'm on a hill, and I can come from the first floor and drop my hay right down below, and the cows are on the lower part of the bank, and makes it really easy to feed in that case. Whereas opposed, sometimes you got to go up to the second floor, bring the hay down. In this case here, it was ideal. So farmers use what was available at the time, the resources, and a lot of times whether it was water, whether it was the lay of the land, but they were very, 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 very resourceful.
Oh, for sure. And maybe we could just talk really quickly about the community that had to go into building those barns.
Yeah, that sense of community and neighbors seemed to be a lot greater of importance back then, when you needed to rely sometimes on a lot of people, and people needed to rely on you, and people helped each other out. Whereas today you're seeing a lot more independence, where people don't seem to know their neighbors as much in the country. And just speaking to my father, who's 30 or 40 years older than me, he remembers a time on the Telagorm where all the neighbors knew each other, and that they helped each other out. And it really created that sense of community too. And you had sometimes just one road that was a community, right? You can drive down the Telagorm maybe 100 years ago and see a schoolhouse, and that was for just that one road, and each road had its own schoolhouse. And so they were very tight-knit, smaller communities. People were really connected with one another. Not to say that everything was way better back then than it was today, but that sense of community was definitely present. We still have it today, but probably in a different form,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, we see it today when disasters happen, that sort of thing, of a fire. People will come together and support families, but we don't see barn raisings anymore.
No, exactly. And even the term, occasionally still here in the valley, the term bee, like, "Oh, we're going to have a bee." And that was an old term that's been around. I think the Scots brought it along, and I still hear some of the old timers still talk, "Oh, we're going to have a bee, and then everybody's going to get together and still build it." Occasionally here, you still see it, but not probably at the extent you did back then, And one thing I wanted to mention too, I thought was really, really cool for anybody who's listening. And this is sort of a bit of a game of mine, but I'll be driving down a road in the country or in the valley, and I'll try to guess which were the oldest properties. And sometimes you can tell because the barn was placed on the west side to usually cover the western prevailing winds, and the house was on the inside of that, on the eastern side of that. So another ingenious ways the farmers had was, okay, well, we protect ourselves from the wind. You create this small little ecosystem, and sometimes they planted a small forest behind it. And that's the game I have with myself. I'll drive down the road and say, okay, cool, that's an old place. Oh, that one's new. Or maybe that one had a barn before, and it's kind of a fun way to see it, because they really did things for practical purposes back then. And it ended up the landscape was beautiful, in many cases because of it. And they always left them. And I know there's another one too, is they always left a big oak or a big tree in the middle of the field when the cows are out in pasture. And you still see those big bur oaks out in the valley here. And in fact, they're beautiful, iconic presences of yesteryear,
Yeah, I've never actually I don't think I ever actually knew that was why the trees were in the middle of the fields, because now oftentimes that's in a cornfield or something, but the farmers don't take those trees down. They stay. They're a testament, I guess.
Yeah, and from what I was told, was that a lot of cows were out to pasture back then, a lot more than they are today, and that was a shady place for them to go underneath in the summertime and to, chew the cud, so to speak, right?
So I have one last question. So if anybody wanted to go down a road in the valley to see some of these older properties, where's one of the best roads to see some of these things that you're talking about? Maybe the oldest farming landscape in the valley. Can you think of it?
Yeah. I think if you went down the New Erin, you'd probably see a few. If you went down the lower concession in Ormstown, there's still a couple of them there. And on the Tellegorm, I'd say there's a few of them. Yeah, if you went to Tellegorm all the way up towards Howick on the Range Trois there, you would see a few as well. You can see the newer ones, and you can see the older ones. So it's like just paying attention and seeing what the landscape has to tell. And sometimes you can pick up little clues here and there,
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. This was always a fascinating chat with you.
No, thank you very much, Sarah. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and anytime.
So we've talked about heritage from the aspect of plants, heirlooms, and we've looked at some buildings and some structures. Now we take a look at those who are really interested in the heritage as a hobby, is just something that interests them. And we have locally the Chateauguay Valley Antique Association, CVAA is its shortened name, centered on the Rennie farm up on the Covey Hill. That's been there for the association has been there for about 40 years, and there's a century-old barn and general store, and they run an annual show which brings in 2,000 to 3,000 people from across the valley, but also from Montreal and other locations. And I know the name Rennie is linked to you, Sarah. There's a family history there, but it's a very enthusiastic association that helps to keep some of our heritage alive.
Yes, definitely. It's a property that is sort of within my extended family. It's a very special property for sure. I actually got married there, and I have memories of chasing crayfish, and there's a pond out front, and a lot of people have a lot of great memories that have been built up around the CVAA show that's been there. They've held 38 shows in their 40 years because, of course, COVID might have kept them from putting on a couple in their history. And I went there. They're doing an auction right now because they're having to move. So, as you mentioned, they're relocating. And they've been using the barn and the general store that's on this property as well, which is a 200-year-old building general store that used to sit on the border. And both of the barn and the building are full of antiques and heirloom, just an incredibly rich collection that belongs to the CVAA that so many people have donated to over the years. And so they're having to auction that off now. And so I went during the viewing, and I sat down with 4 members of the CVAA. So I sat down with Judy Mather, who was the president, and I sat down with Pearl Fennell, who was one of the founders, along with Renee Labelle and Gary Ouimet. And we had a bit of a chat about how important maintaining this attachment to the agricultural heritage of the area is, and what they think might happen in the future. As we look towards a very changed environment with commercial farming.
This is 38 years?
Well, it's actually more than that. It's the 38th show, but we didn't have shows during COVID, and so we missed a couple of years.
So you guys are probably closer to 40 then. Did any of you ever think 40 years down the road you'd still be doing this?
Absolutely not. You didn't know that.
And all of us mostly had ancestors that were doing farming at the time. They grew up on farmers. Their grandfather had a farm. Their uncle had a farm. So going back to basically our roots to see what transpired then, how hard they worked, different lifestyle than today's lifestyle. I actually worked with horses when I was between 6 and 10 years old at my uncle's farm. Today, you tell somebody they work with horses, they see it on YouTube or they'll see it on Google, but they didn't experience it. They don't understand the equipment because they never were exposed to it. So it's just nice to be able to pass that on to another generation.
Because even the equipment 40 years ago, there was some technology that had come in. It was a big change. And then when you look at what people are working with now,
not comparable.
Just the horsepower on the tractors now is...
Yeah. And the pricing and the different way of farming today as opposed to what it was in that generation. Now, 100-acre farm was a big farm. 100-acre farm today is a postage stamp, basically, compared to what they're doing.
Yes, because I can remember as a kid, we rented a house by a farm, and that's how I ended up working with the farmer and his son, and we did haying, 10, 12,000 bales of hay on a good year, and all by hand, baler and rake. Before it was after horses, I should say, after horses, and it was a lot of work. But as teenagers, I'd say we enjoyed doing it actually, which is kind of funny to say, but it had a good meaning to me now.
With when I was little, my father was using horses on the farm with raking the hay and the dump rake and that. I can remember that. And then when he got the first C tractor and we had to drive it, and it was a case of I was so small that he had to put blocks of wood on the clutch and that, which is not considered safe now for children. So I didn't have to slide off the seat under the steering wheel to punch the clutch when you had to stop when we were picking up bales of hay and that. Started out loose hay, and then so over the years I've seen the progression of the farming and that, and it's a lot of big changes.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about the CVAA then. So this started, and you guys have built up an incredible community over the 40 years. Why do you think there's such an interest every year?
I think people are interested because it takes them back to their roots. And for a lot of people that have grown up in the city, to come out here and to experience it, it's like an educational experience, but so much better than out of a history book or from YouTube or that. It's because it was like living history. It's like going to Upper Canada Village. You were a part of it. And the other thing I always noticed here, didn't see people going around with long faces. Everybody at our show was always smiling, happy. It was more of a community getting together and visiting. It was a social weekend. It wasn't the high-powered excitement of a fair, shall we say. Whereas here, the children could run around and they were safe, and it started out being just the local community wanting to preserve the history.
Yeah, we bring the people here because they like to see something different.
I think one of the keys is it's low key by design to stay low key. We don't need bells and whistles. We need relaxation. And people come from the city, and this year we were at a new location. It went well, and we still got feedback from the visitors saying how they enjoyed the low-key aspect of it, that they can have their kids around with them without many distractions. So if we're going to keep our roots or keep it to a low-key event, we got to really work at keeping it at a lower and not get sucked into. Even the flea market itself is pretty much antique stuff, vintage stuff. I don't know if antique's the right word, but a lot of vintage stuff. And that means stuff to people. There may be something their grandfather had, or they see it in there and they take that one item home because it means something to them. And I think that's still the attraction. So I think that's what we have to maintain our focus on. The challenge, again, as I stated, is the next generation.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that sort of leads me into the next question, which is, why is it so important, do you think, that we remember these roots and remember where farming has come from?
I think maybe because we're trying to roots, but our values that we had, those intrinsic things of working together, the friendship, the relationships through generations, seeing things like these old time things, and you think, oh, my grandmother wore a dress like this, or my mother, or my great grandmother. And then it makes you feel that those people aren't forgotten.
And so there's a lot of interest in the auction, I imagine. What are some of your just thoughts on seeing some of this go? This is a collection that's 40 years in the making.
I said we all have to grieve the loss of it, but we have to move on. It's that time, so it's sad, but then we have to think that there's going to be future, and hopefully everybody who comes and buys a piece of this history will preserve it for the future, because that was our goal. Was in starting Norma Graham and starting this, was she called it Hinchinbrook's 2-day museum every year, and to preserve for the future generations, we're doing our bit, and so hopefully these things will be preserved for the future.
If you are in the Chateauguay Valley of Quebec, southwest of Montreal down towards the New York border, you may want to check out the CVAA auction for the artifacts and contents of the general store. The auction takes place at the Rennie farm in Hinchinbrook on October the 5th, starting at 10 a.m. Viewing takes place the day before on October the 4th. We've discussed heritage plants, tomatoes and apples, and heritage buildings. Now let's find out about heritage livestock. Our reporter, Callan Forrester, sat down with Elwood Quinn of Heritage Livestock Canada to talk about the history of heritage breeds in Quebec and why conserving these animals is so important.
Welcome, Elwood. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Farm to Food podcast. We know that you're coming here from Heritage Livestock Canada.
We work across Canada and internationally trying to conserve as compared to preserve heritage livestock. And we are losing domestic animals at a rate of about 10 times quicker than anything in the wild. So if we think the pandas are, there's 4,000 or 5,000 of them. We've got breeds of animals here that we've got the only one in Canada. We've got one of 12 in all the world, that sort of thing.
That's an insane statistic that it's like 10 times more in domesticity than it is in the wild. I don't think that that's something that a lot of people would expect. Do you mind defining what the difference between conservation and preservation is?
Conservation is keeping the thing alive. Preservation is putting it in a mason jar and putting it in the freezer and bringing the seeds back out 10 years from now. We can't do that with our livestock for the most part. Yes, we do a little bit of semen storage, embryo storage, but we want to keep them alive. That's the essence of what we do, is trying to keep them alive.
For you, what is the importance of keeping these animals alive and these species alive that we're seeing disappear so quickly?
Genetic diversity is essential, I think, for each generation of us to maintain something in the way of feeding ourselves, taking care of ourselves. If we let the multinationals do it and the corporates, yes, we do have now in all of North American agriculture, we have one breed of animal that produces all the milk we drink. We have one breed of chicken that produces all the eggs we eat, etc. And they are ultra efficient. The comparison would be, for somebody not into it, Ferrari or Lamborghini would take you by land from New York to LA, the quickest and smoothest way, but not a whole lot of good to take the kids up to Tremblant to do skiing on Saturday morning. So we've got the off-road animals.
Help us to define exactly what heritage farming is for people who feel like that's a newer term for them.
Heritage farming would be, in my estimation, the effort put forth by someone with some kind of land base to farm and keep alive either plants or animals or technique. of farming for the next generation, for their neighbors, for to feed themselves and others. Less than 1% of the population make 95% of the food we eat. But that's not a healthy situation. We work with the breeds of animals that were part of Canada's history in excess of 50 years.
What are some of the breeds or animals that we might see in the region still that are considered heritage livestock?
There's Julie Mason and her husband doing Canadian cows. Yeah, the Masons. Northeast of Montreal, we got a girl keeping a bunch of Canadian cows, making cheese from Canadian cow's milk. And she also keeps a couple of Canadian horses, Chanticleer chickens. Mark Harmer over east of Sherbrooke has large black pigs. We just brought 3 baby pigs in from southwestern Ontario for his future production. He's also trying to get the Hungarian yellow chicken brought back to some kind of numbers. That's a chicken that was saved from extinction by a doctor from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, who was at Macdonald College in the 1960s. And Emily Duham over at Huntington we fixed her up with a flock of Shropshire sheep. Here at the farm, we've got the Canadian horse and White Park cattle that came to Canada during the Second World War, during the Blitz. Winston Churchill wanted them saved if they lost Britain. That's kind of some of the history that we do, along with the Shropshire sheep and Cotswold sheep. And those are the 2 wool types that built the woolen mills that became the British Empire.
Why do you think that people are straying away from heritage breeds sometimes and focusing on different sort of livestock that isn't part of such a rich history here?
Farmers are some of the most competitive guys in North America. We want to be the first guy out there in the field with our tractor if we see a neighbor out there before us. So we are not interested in who's got that weird looking Hampshire pig over there. There's only 3 of them in Canada. For commercial agriculture, it's that competitive edge where we got to be out there with the best of the boys or girls.
For you, what is your ultimate goal with Heritage Livestock Canada, and what do you hope happens in the next couple of years?
We'd like to see the animals back in numbers that we could put our feet up, relax, smoke the short end of a cigar, and not have to do this work to keep these guys alive. We're losing a bunch of the old guys and gals and a lot of elderly ladies keeping animals that are just unable to keep them anymore. And it's hard to find young people with time, energy, and interest to do the kinds of things that need to be done to keep these numbers from dwindling, and extinction is forever. There may be a lot of Highland cattle out there, but none of them are registered. So if we can't trace them, it's like a car with no license plate on it. It ain't a whole lot of good. We have to do it.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I really hope that within the next few years you can sit down with that cigar. From livestock to poultry now, Hugh chased down an interview with one of Canada's biggest heritage poultry farmers. Here's Hugh's interview with Étienne Laliberté of Élevage Val-Plante Breeding. Étienne is the provincial representative for the American Bantam Association and the American Poultry Association.
Where did your passion for poultry come from?
We have commercial chickens on my father's side since 1915. And in Saint-Théodore is the family farm, Ferme Clovis Gauthier Fils. And my great-grandfather, Clovis Gauthier, had turkeys, had layers, had dual purpose, and way before having the standardized for meat and for layers in the 50s. So there's a big chicken base on my father's side, but when we say Étienne Laliberté, Élevage Val-Plante, the Plante family name is on my mother's side, and we had dairy, hogs, beef, and Belgians. In 2011, I was 2021, and there was a bird auction in Granby a club that doesn't exist anymore, and I bought my first pair of black Wyandotte Bantams. So that started for the breed, and I gathered and I imported and I traveled to the Maritime, Ontario, and I gathered many varieties of that breed, the Wyandottes, which is an American breed from the New York State region. And the Wyandotte name was associated with the Wyandotte tribe, and the Wyandottes are the cousins with the American name of the Huron-Wendat from the Quebec City region. My partner, Francois, who is still at his place, he has 10 varieties of standards. I have 16 varieties of Bantams. And with my nutrition formulations I'm already Canada's biggest breeder of Wyandotte for numbers. I'm not selling too many pullets because I don't sell any chicks. I don't sell any eggs. The only way to get the selective efficiency I have is to breed everything to maturity and sell birds that have the defects I want to clear out from my population. And with that, my personal fun is to create varieties, color schemes on European recipes with my North American ingredients I have in hand.
You're doing selection to improve the breeds within your flock, and then you've got others that you're selling to other breeders?
I have 5% of my clients who are breeders who want to acquire the piece of the puzzle they need to get better genetic, better color, temper, whatever trait they're looking for. And 95% is for city ladies that won't have better, nice birds on their lawn.
And who are the people that are interested, given that not many farms have heritage poultry breeds? As you know, commercial lines are very select and private.
So after COVID, we had a big strike, big emphasis on people wanting to have birds, and people realized it's the same cost to keep a heritage bird, keep a commercial bird. Cost to buy the bird will be different, but feed, shaving, time will be the same. So commercial layers right now at $20 a piece, 19 weeks. Rather, I'm more in the 75, 80, 125, depending on the variety per bird on the purebred sector. I've proved and I explained to buyers there's no reason why you would buy a purebred for 25. The seller is not making any money here. So I was explaining to sellers on the purebred sector, birds should be $50 a piece and over, depending on your time and effort. But if they do represent the breed and variety they should represent, there's no reason to sell them less than $50 a piece. They eat more than commercials. They take more time to mature. And a lady came here and bought $1,000 for 5 birds. I didn't force her an arm. It's not something that is very common. But when people are evaluating their summertime, they want birds in April. They know they're going to have fun with them until October. They might not even keep them.
Do any of the genetics that you maintain, develop, do they go into the commercial herds in any way?
They would have 60, 70 years ago. So in those years, strain were important. Purebred was appreciated until the 50s, where you had the hybrids for layers and for meat, and it completely divided the sector. So right now, my purebred Bantam Wyandottes are no use for the commercial sector at all. The commercial genetic companies right now, Eberacres, have and they do maintain pure lines of heritage, Plymouth Rocks, Cornish, Rhode Island Reds, and they are not going to ask people like us, dirty, unvaccinated, carrying stuff, to re-implement their lines. It's most likely not going to happen. I truly realize my pleasure is not only to make and maintain a breed, it's to show it. Show it with visitors that look at it and have opinions and have appreciation, visual appreciation, emotional appreciation. At the end, I might sell them a bird today or in the next coming months, but at least to show the visitors there's more than just white birds, than more than just brown layers. There's a whole variety world of colors and patterns and forms. And I think that people now that understand more breeding varieties, when they want to have a nice looking bird, I'm always happy and proud to sell them a nice looking hen and pullet to put in their backyard.
All right. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So now we have a few news briefs from agriculture and the agri-food sector across Quebec. In the main news, an early frost was a complete surprise for farmers in southern Quebec. They were ambushed by Mother Nature on the mornings of Saturday the 20th and Sunday the 21st of September with an early frost that was heavy for many and a killing frost for some. A killing frost makes the plants dormant, effectively bringing an end to any further growth or production. A heavy frost doesn't necessarily kill the plant, but does enough damage to slow it down to the point where any growth or additional production is minimal. A killing frost occurs when the ground temperature dips below 0 degrees centigrade, which often means that the air temperature a few feet above the ground can be even colder. The cold air freezes the water in the plant cells, which then rupture as the ice expands, killing the plant. The average date of the first killing frost in the Chateauguay Valley has been moving later and later into the fall and is now October 16th. So a frost that cold and so early has not been experienced for many years. Horticultural farmers have been forced to pick all the peppers and tomatoes and vegetables and the like in their fields and put them into storage. Cash crops, such as corn and soybeans, will not add any more yield and start to be ready for harvest earlier than usual. There's also been low demand in the United States for several vegetables, and it's a growing area of exports for Quebec farmers. La Terre de Chez Nous, the weekly French-language farm newspaper, reports that Quebec vegetable growers have been getting lower than normal prices due to sluggish demand in several product categories on the U.S. markets, combined with abundant harvests. There is also an observation that the trade war is having an impact. Just as Canadians want to buy Canadian, Americans also seem to want to buy American. Produce such as peppers, carrots, and onions are most affected, and local markets are facing competition from Mexican produce as well. Every fall, with the return to school, families have to pay out more in terms of school supplies, so there is a slowdown in food sales as budgets are stretched. This year, the phenomenon seems to be exacerbated by the continuing food inflation and poorer economic conditions. And some big cheeses recently took home some rewards. The Fromagerie du Presbytère Talia cheese has won the Cassius Gold, the most coveted award at Sélection Cassius, Quebec's cheese competition. This is the first for this cheese from the Centre Quebec region. The 25th edition of the prestigious competition took place at the Voltigeur de Québec Armory, and the highlights were the excellence of Quebec cheeses and showcases the expertise of those who make them. The competition aims to introduce consumers to the creativity of cheesemakers, which is expressed in a multitude of innovative, high-quality products. Sélection Cassius is the only competition dedicated to recognizing and promoting cheeses produced in Quebec, and it's open to all cheesemakers regardless of the size of the business, the type of the cheese, or the type of milk they use.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Farm to Food podcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for helping bring this initiative to life, the Livestock Breeders Association for our studio facilities at the Expo Ormstown Fairground, and Quinn Farm in Notre-Dame-de-Île-Perrot for promotional support.
We'd also like to thank the Community Media Strategic Support Fund and the Government of Canada for their financial support. In addition, the Bourse d'Initiative en Entrepreneuriat Collectif for their contribution to equip the podcast studio. And, of course, our thanks to Farmer Phil, who opened up the show. Be sure to join us in 2 weeks for the next Farm to Food podcast episode. We'll have lots more interesting stories on the journey of food from the land to your kitchen table. Thanks for listening.
This program is made possible by the volunteer directors on the board of the Chateauguay Valley Community Information Services, a nonprofit social enterprise with charitable status. We would love your support to keep this podcast going. Donations can be made at farmtofood.ca, and we can issue a tax receipt for donations over $25.